In this presentation, I'll be exploring themes of sexism and oppression in the film The Virgin Suicides. I'll be analyzing and comparing it to two philosophical literature pieces about feminist theories. The film The Virgin Suicides, which was released in 1999 and directed by Sofia Coppola, is based on the book The Virgin Suicides, written by Jeffrey Eugenides. The film is set in Michigan during the 1970s and revolves around five teenage sisters living in a strict and repressive household. The story is narrated by a group of teenage boys in the neighborhood who develop a fascination with the five sisters. These neighborhood boys attempt to piece together the chain of events leading up to the girls' suicides. Now, before I dive into it, I'm going to introduce some crucial characters. We first have the main characters, which is the five Lisbon sisters. Starting from the left to the right, we have Cecilia Lisbon, played by Hannah Hall, who is the youngest at 13 years old in the story. Lux Lisbon, played by Kirsten Dunst, who is 14 years old. Bonnie Lisbon, played by Chelsea Swain, who is 15 years old. Mary Lisbon, played by AJ Cook, who is 16 years old. And lastly, Therese Lisbon, who is played by Leslie Heyman and is the oldest in the story at 17 years old. Some additional characters who are also important to mention are the parents of the Lisbon girls. We have Mr. and Mrs. Lisbon, played by James Woods and Kathleen Turner. You have the four boys who narrate the story, and their individual identities are pretty insignificant to the story, therefore they collectively are referred to as the neighborhood boys. They do everything together, and their group as a whole is more important to the analysis of this movie. Lastly, we have Trip Fontaine, played by Josh Hartnett, who is a high school student that goes to the same school as the Lisbon girls. It's also important to note that with Trip, he's regarded as a high school heartthrob and develops an intimate relationship with Lux Lisbon later on in the story. Now, the first philosophical reading I'll be referring to that is relevant to Virgin Suicides is titled Sexism by Annie Cudd and Leslie E. Jones. First off, Cudd and Jones argue that women have worse life prospects than men, and this can be seen in all aspects of life, including education, health, jobs, and safety, just to name a few. They explain that these differences are attributable to two different factors. The first is that women are by nature inferior to men, and this includes psychological and biological differences between men and women that are often used to justify their differing life prospects. The second explanation is that women are systematically disadvantaged by society, meaning that there are societal elements structured to worsen the lives of women. And one of the ways in which women are systematically disadvantaged by society is through sexism, which Cudd and Jones dive deeper into and mainly focus about. According to Cudd and Jones, sexism is a systematic, pervasive, but often subtle force that maintains the oppression of women. Additionally, they break down sexism into three different levels: institutional sexism, interpersonal sexism, and unconscious sexism. All three types of sexism which can be seen in the Virgin Suicides. Institutional sexism are unjust sexual inequalities in the explicit and implicit norms that govern social institutions. The film exemplifies the implicit norms through religious institutions, specifically in the movie, the Catholic Church. As Mr. and Mrs. Lisbon are devout Catholics, the Lisbon girls are raised by conservative and faithful principles. Further, the image of being a virtuous woman through God is maintained through a woman's virginity and purity. Therefore, Mr. and Mrs. Lisbon strive to maintain or obtain this image for their daughters largely through sexual repression. The specific rules that are enforced in the Lisbon household will later be discussed when I start talking about interpersonal sexism. And secondly, the explicit rules of institutional sexism are exemplified through educational institutions, specifically in the film, the public school system. Now, towards the end of the story in the film, when Lux sneaks away from her sisters to have sex with Trip Fontaine on the football field after prom night, she does not return home until the morning after. Due to Lux's failure to make curfew, even though the rest of the girls made it home on time, all of the girls are heavily punished because of Lux's actions. And they are punished by being pulled out of school and unable to leave their house. Their absence goes unnoticed and unchecked by the school, and this highlights the lack of protocol and care that the school system has for the children in need, for children in need. Instead, the school's lack of intervention, which is governed by not having strict, explicit policies for students' absences, allows Mr. and Mrs. Lisbon to keep the girls away from school, trapped in their home, and this ultimately leads to the girls' suicide. Now we have interpersonal sexism, and this involves intentional and unintentional interactions between people that promote sexual inequalities. As I have briefly mentioned in the last slide, these interactions can be in the strict and repressive rules that the Lisbon girls must follow. Some of the rules, just to name a few, is they're not allowed to wear makeup, they can't go to parties, and if they do host the parties, which is seen in the movie, is like chaperoned and very heavily watched by the parents. They're not allowed to fraternize and hang out with men, let alone date, and they're only allowed to go to really church and school, besides their home being the third place. Another like more specific example that I think really embodies this well, is that the girls are given the opportunity to go to prom. However, the narrator states that it didn't make any difference which pattern of their dream dresses the girls each chose. Mrs. Lisbon added an inch to the bust line and 2 inches to the waist and hem. So the modest choice of dress and clothing that they are like forced and put upon to wear, I think is just very symbolic of this pure image that they have to uphold. And because of this, I feel that the Lisbon girls are very sheltered from the outside world, and this limits their exploration of girlhood and adolescence. Last level of sexism is unconscious sexism, and defined by Cudd and Jones, this is the psychological mechanisms and tacit beliefs, emotions, and attitudes that create, constitute, promote, sustain, and or exploit invidious sexual inequalities. Now, to better understand unconscious sexism, the perpetrators often do not have sexist intentions or beliefs. Instead, it is unconscious attitudes that influence unintentional sexist behavior and attitudes. In the Virgin Suicides, this is displayed through the actions of the neighborhood boys. While they do not intentionally mean harm to the Lisbon girls, their behavior, which, to name some of the things they did throughout the movie, includes watching the girls from their window through a telescope, and accessing and reading Cecilia Lisbon's diary after her suicide. It's very obsessive and unhealthy behavior, bordering on stalker. And their actions, which I guess, as I said, is like stalking technically, is yet another added social pressure and social issue that disadvantages women and is a familiar experience to many women. Now, I want to mention that that unconscious sexism does not apply to the parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lisbon. And the reason why I say that they do not exhibit unconscious sexism is because though their intentions are not to harm the Lisbon girls, they would never mean to purposefully harm and hurt their daughters and drive them to suicide. However, they truly do believe in the inferiority of women. They believe in this hierarchy of gender, and that then enforces these rules that they put into their household. So therefore, they consciously do believe in sexist ideologies, which is why they wouldn't be in the unconscious sexism level. Now, the impact of sexism. The distinction of all 3 levels of sexism are important for better understanding the different types and the different disparities that women face. However, it is important to note that all 3 aspects of sexism are interrelated, and Cudd and Jones also really do emphasize this as well. But as all 3 aspects of sexism were present in the Lisbon girls' lives, it had devastating psychological and physical health effects, ultimately influencing their decision to commit suicide. This now brings me to the second philosophical piece that is very much relevant to the Virgin Suicides. In Marilyn Frye's work titled The Politics of Reality, Essays in Feminist Theory, her chapter titled Oppression reveals the sad reality that the Lisbon girls face. In her writing, Frye draws attention to the misuse and misrepresentation of the word oppression. While it is a common misconception for people to believe that oppressing is oppressive to those who oppress as well as those they oppress, Fry argues that this is not true and thus reiterates the features and characteristics of an oppressed group. She states that a common feature of oppressed people is that they're often caught in a double bind, which is situations in which the oppressed people's options are reduced to very few and all of them expose one to negative consequences. Now, the double bind can be seen two ways in the Virgin Suicide, sorry. The first way is through the Lisbon girls, like, as a whole. The double bind can be applied to all the Lisbon girls in respect to upholding their pure and faithful image enforced by their parents. And in this double bind situation, if they choose to comply to their parents' constraining rules, they are deprived of expressing themselves and exploring their youth. And additionally, they continue to live this dull, mundane, and miserable life that has been planned out for them by their parents. Now, the other option is for them to disobey their parents' rules and beliefs. And if they choose to do this, regardless of whether they're doing it discreetly or not, it's going to go both ways, the same way. They, one, have no options of exploring and expressing themselves safely. And just some instances I can see them running into would be having unprotected and unsafe sex, getting caught in dangerous situations when sneaking out, breaking curfew, basically like breaking the law. There's just a lot of different things that they can face. And they also risk facing even worse repercussions from their parents if they get caught. And we see this when Lux breaks curfew, which I've mentioned before. Lux breaks curfew, and the girls get punished by going on full-on lockdown. Now, as we can see, the options provided to the Lisbon sisters are limited and face negative consequences, irregardless of the path they choose. There is no good option that's obtainable for them. Now, the second instance in which we see the double bind situation is specifically with Lux Lisbon. And the reason why I say this is because Lux Lisbon is a lot more rebellious than her sisters, and she tries to kind of explore her sexuality, though it's still pretty limited and restricted. She's a lot more open and expressive with it, I feel. So there's obviously a really big difference. And this can be seen specifically with her relationship to Trip. While she's perceived as the wild sister, she is seen by the narrators frequently hanging out with men and making out with them on the rooftop of her house. Her relationship with Trip Fontaine, though, is different in a way that she shares that she feels, and he feels as well, that they shared a deeper, more intimate connection. Compared to her being with like other random guys, which are like they go unnamed in the story. And it's because she feels something special with him that she sleeps with him on the football field after prom. Despite their shared connection, Trip leaves Lux on the football field after sleeping with him before she wakes up. Now, Trip's attitudes towards Lux is representative of the double bind situation, because in this situation, where the ultimate goal is for Lux to get Trip to like her, she has the option of either sleeping with him and giving into his sexual advances or ignoring him. If she does not give in to him, Trip will eventually lose interest in Lux, and she'll be viewed as just a part of her prude, uptight sisters. However, in the story, Lux gives Trip just the right amount of like attention and denial to captivate and interest him. In the movie, we can see this when an older Trip reflects on his time and his relationship with Lux. He says that it was so easy with all the other girls, but she wouldn't look at me. That girl drove me crazy. Now, despite her successful attempt to catch his attention, once she gives into his sexual desire and sleeps with him, he loses all interest, and thus is why he leaves her stranded on the football field. Again, with this double bind situation, we are seeing that there is no good obtainable option for her. Now, in this point in the story, the girls have been pulled out of school for weeks now and have no connection with the outside world. No longer able to withstand the solitary confinement of their house, the social pressures in their home and social life, and the restriction of their freedom, the girls decide to collectively end their lives as they saw the only viable option to free them from their misery and really take control of their life. The Lisbon Girls' life story shows the prevalence of sexism, along with the negative impact that sexual repression and female oppression have on an individual, especially at such a young age and crucial turning point in a woman's life. The Virgin Suicides is arguably a modern day feminist work as it focuses on the psychological effects of sexism that many women still face today.